Hi and welcome back to Retronaut, and today we're going to take another look at the Apple IIe. This is the third machine in the Apple IIe dynasty, which started in 1977, the love child of a friendship between Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, who were both electronics nerds over in California. I'm sure I don't really need to tell you that much about those guys. They went on to become very famous, especially Steve Jobs, as in his later career he came back and saved Apple from destruction and eventually made it the most valuable company in the world. So those two guys together have a pretty remarkable story to be told. Now, in that video, the basic premise was, can we use an Apple IIe today? And I had some complaints from people saying that, it's not exactly a machine that you can load up Photoshop on and do some desktop publishing work or, train an AI model or something like that. And my intention was never to say that, this is a machine that is currently that practical as a computer. However, it is still a computer and it could actually be used for something, although these days obviously its use case would be pretty limited. But it's important to bear in mind that the 6502 processor, which is used in this machine, is still actually in use today in devices. They're still manufactured, they're very tiny these days and they can be embedded in various systems, and they still are actually used as modern computers. So yeah, bear that in mind. Now, in that video, we talked about the fact that this machine has 8 expansion slots, which makes it extremely expandable. And that came about because of a vision that Steve Wozniak had, that he wanted this machine to be a sort of like a hacker's paradise, a machine that you could make into anything you want. So anyway, let's get on with actually using this machine, because we don't want to talk about theory or the background or anything like that really in this video so much today, although I will delve into it a little bit later when we talk about certain devices, because I think it's really interesting to find out the context of these things so we understand why we might be interested in them, why we might want to try them out and use them. Because we are now in 2025, and obviously over the years this video will then slip into the past, and this machine becomes more remote from us. However, it still is a very important part of computing history. And I mean, I don't need to illustrate that any more than by saying that if it wasn't for this machine, there would be no Apple today, and there would have been no iPhone, let's put it that way. So yeah, you've got to bear that in mind. It is a very, very important machine. So the first thing we're going to look at with this machine is actually getting an image, because right now we have a machine with no display. So let's move on and do that, and we'll try and get it set up so that we can actually use it in terms of, well, being able to see something. It isn't actually as simple as it sounds, so I think it's definitely worth going through. So let's do that next. But before we do that, let's have a quick word from our sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay, where you can make your tech dreams a reality. Starting on September the 1st and running for the entire month of September and October, PCBWay has an offer on Purple Solder Mask. Yes, if you were Prince, you could have your Purple Solder Mask for absolutely free. So why not hop online right now to get those vibrant PCBs on their way to you. And if that wasn't enough, PCBWay are also offering a special discount on 3D printing with TPU. Prints over 20 grams will enjoy increasing discounts as the part gets heavier, with a maximum saving of 40%. So why not head over to PCBWay right now? Because whether it's PCB prototyping, PCB assembly, 3D printing, or even CNC machining, PCBWay is the way. Starting with an instant quote for your PCB projects, PCBWay will leap into action, building your PCB, assembling it for you if you wish, and once it's passed their quality tests, it'll be winging its way to you in a flash. PCBWay, PCB prototyping the easy way. So if we have a look at the back of the machine, as I showed you in the last video, we have the only I/O we actually have in the default machine, the base spec model of the IIe. We have a composite phono jack here, 2 3.5mm audio DINs, and basically this takes audio in, this takes audio out, which would go to a tape deck, and then over here we have a joystick port. That's it, that's all we have. What we're going to look at right now is this phono jack here, which carries composite video. So let me just show you one of those jacks so you can see what they look like. So this is a phono jack. It's not exactly a HDMI cable. It's not very sophisticated by today's standards. All it really has is a pin in the middle, and that carries the signal. And then on the outside, you've got a sheath, and that connects to ground, and that just makes sure that that signal is grounded. Because of this, you can only send one signal down it, and the way the Apple II produces video is by combining the luminosity and the chrominosity, in other words, the brightness and the color in the video image, into a single signal. This isn't ideal because what it does is it causes interference between those two signals, and it doesn't produce a very good picture. However, for the time, it was pretty standard. It was used in security cameras and things like that. And when Steve Wozniak put it in the machine, his intention was that people would use the machine with CRT Monitor, which is quite common in the hacker community. They gave you a pretty good display. Now, most people at home obviously didn't have CRT monitors, so what they did was they used an RF modulator. That takes a composite signal and turns it into radio frequency, and then that would allow this to be used with a television. But what we're going to do today is we're going to use a monitor like we would have back in 1977, and I actually have a PVN monitor, so let me just show that to you. This is the monitor here. It's quite a lump, believe me. It's quite heavy. This is actually a broadcast quality monitor, and I got it part of a bundle a couple of years ago when I bought an Amiga 4000. This was actually part of that kit. I won't go into that story here. Let's just focus on this. But this is actually a color monitor from, I would probably say, the 90s. Very high quality, very expensive for the time. If we have a look at the back of it, being careful here because it is pretty heavy, here we have a connector, and as you can see, it says video in. And what it's expecting is actually to have composite plugged in through there. Now, this uses a connector called a BNC connector, which is a variation on the phono connector, as it were. It's still just a single electrical value going in through there. There's the ground, and then in the center there's a little pin. So I'm going to have to use some kind of adapter to go from the phono that we have on the back of the Apple II to the BNC on this here. I do actually have that, and I've got a cable set up and ready to go. So let's plug it in and try turning on the machine. I was going to say boot up the machine, but we're not really booting it because there's no drive or anything like that. So let me turn it around. And I'm going to plug in the power supply here for the Apple II, plugging into the IEC connector on the back. And I need a power supply for this as well, which uses the same IEC. As I said in the last video, these were very standard back in the day. I'm just going to plug this in. And let me just show you the BNC cable. So the reason why this monitor has a BNC connector rather than a phono is because it has this thing here that can turn and will actually lock it on. And generally, it's just a better quality connector used in higher end audio and visual equipment. The problem we have is that this cable has these on both ends, so I need an adapter to actually get it working. So let me just plug this in. There we are. So now I've adapted it from BNC to phono. So I can plug this now into the back of the monitor, and I can plug this into the Apple II, and we should be good to go. Let's give that a go. So I'm going to put this into the video in on here, and I'm just going to lock it in. There we are, and then turn to lock. And then I'm going to plug this into the phono over here. There we are. It's plugged in. And let me put this on here. It should take the weight, hopefully. Yeah, it's quite a sturdy machine, this. And let me bring that just a little bit forward so you can see the monitor a little bit more clearly. There we go. Now, I must say this was actually a kind of typical setup that you would have had back in the 1970s when this machine was released. It wouldn't have been a PVM like this. This came a lot later. This is actually a Sony Trinitron, which is a very high quality monitor. It would have been a shorter unit, and it would have actually sat quite neatly on top of the machine there. So let's turn on the monitor. There we are. So let's not dilly-dally and turn on the Apple II and see what we get. There's a beep telling you that it's on. There's the power light. And there we go. That's it. The Apple II is now ready to use. So I'm just going to type a little bit of basic here. 10, let's say print hello. Yeah. And then 20, go to 10. Yeah, let's try listing that. Does list work? Yes, it does. There we are. That's our basic program. And I can obviously type run and press enter, and it does the classic loop. So there we are. The Apple II is working. Now, obviously, in this state, we could then move on to look at disk drives and things like that. But before I do that, I want to show you some other solutions for working with video. And these might be a little bit more practical for you for a number of reasons. So obviously, this monitor is pretty expensive these days. I think they cost about maybe £150 if you try and get them on eBay. What would that be? Something like maybe $200 in America. It's pretty heavy. It's probably prone to breaking. I mean, at this point, this particular monitor is about 30 years old. So it's not exactly fresh out of the box. So there is a chance that this will break sooner than later, and it's quite hard to repair. The other type of monitors that I'm talking about, the security monitors from the 1970s, obviously even rarer again. But it's really nice to see actually that this monitor does work. So I'm going to reset this by pressing Control and reset. There we are, we've gone back to there. And if we want to reset the machine completely, not just break out the software, we can press Control, open Apple here and reset. So let's just do that. There we go. And that is the classic Apple IIe display. Actually here, this means it's enhanced. It's an enhanced IIe, and that means it has some of the features of the Apple IIc. So let's get another monitor and try that out. Let's get that out of the way. Just undo the BNC and take it off the back. Take out the phono from the Apple II. Gird my loins. This is a pretty heavy little monitor. There we are. Just put this down here for now. So the next screen I want to show you is this one. I bought this on AliExpress. It's pretty good. It has quite a few different connection types on it. It's about 14 inches. Looking at the bottom, it has audio in left and right, composite video, which is what we need, HDMI, so you can use it with modern screens, and also has VGA. So quite a good little retro monitor, really. From what I understand, it's intended for use with video security systems, and also it can be used with things like CNC machines, things like that. So it's just basically a small little monitor that you might use with equipment that requires slightly more legacy connections. But it does also have HDMI as well. So I bought this because I thought it'd be quite a cool retro monitor to have in the cabin. So for this to work, we need to plug in the phono cable into the composite out on the Apple II. Plug this here into the yellow port, which is composite video. And I need the power supply here. Okay, turn on. And hopefully you should get a picture. What would I say about it? Well, unfortunately it does have a bit of a green cast, and I didn't really see that being evident with the PVM, but it's definitely there on this monitor. It could be to do with the brightness. Maybe the brightness is a little bit too high, the gain is too high, and that would have a tendency possibly to introduce some extra signal that you wouldn't necessarily see on something like a PVM or an original security monitor. The advantage of this monitor over one of those is that it is new. It also has HDMI on it as well, so you can use it for other purposes. And it has VGA as well, so obviously it can be used with a PC. So I think it's a pretty good choice to have, definitely. But the green cast is a bit of an issue for me. At the end of the day, I think the third option that I have coming up, which is probably the best one to go for. This was about 110. You're paying for delivery coming from China, but when it does arrive, it will be brand new. So that's something to be borne in mind. If you bought a PVM, you're going to be talking about probably 150 to 300 pounds, depending on the vendor. Some of them are actually charging too much for them, to be honest. I think they're really worth about 150. So that's that option. Another option, and it's my preferred option, is to use a card that converts the signal, the video image basically inside the Apple II, into either a DVI or a HDMI. Well, I was going to say signal, but port, let's put it that way. It turns out that DVI, as far as I understand it, is a subset of HDMI, in that if you feed a DVI signal through a HDMI connector, it will actually work. What you're missing if you do that is you're not going to have any audio, because DVI didn't actually contain audio in the signal. But apart from that, they are very compatible. So I've got one of those cards. It's called VidHD. So let's have a look at that. So this is a VidHD card, and it has a connector on the left-hand side. This is a PCB, obviously. And you can see there's a heatsink coming through, and that hints at there is actually a system on a chip here, which does most of the heavy lifting for this. The PCB here is mainly to actually just interface this with the Apple II. So this was produced relatively recently. I don't think these in particular are in production anymore, unfortunately, because they are really good. You can see there, copyright 2018. I think they stopped being produced around 2020, something like that. But there are other cards on the market. I've seen them, and I'll actually put links to those in the description for this video, which you can get, which support DVI video. So what we need to do is plug this into one of the slots there. I'm going to use this extension cable here to then get this HDMI from out of the card to the back of the machine. I've got a little screw there, which allows us to connect it to one of the slots and hold it in place. I do need to make it a 3D printed bracket so I can actually mount it completely correctly, but for now this will do. So as I said in the last video, this isn't currently screwed in, so it's quite easy to open. I just need to pull on that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put this cable in. I'm going to get it in position so it's in the right spot. And I'm going to put it in this slot here. I've taken off one of these little blockers on the back. I have a bag full of these and I keep them in my Apple IIe box. So I keep them if I ever need to put them back in. There's another one there. I think that I use that with a serial card. And these are with disk drives and things like that. So once we've got that in place, we can plug in this into the HDMI here. So just plug that in here. And as far as I'm aware, this will actually go into any of the slots. But generally, we tend to use these more up here. So I'm going to actually just put this into slot number 1 down here. So we'll just plug that into the slot. So obviously I've just been firm in the way I put that in. And that is ready to go. So what we need to do now is just get the HDMI cable from this. Plug it in here. And then hopefully when we turn it on, we should have video. Okay, we're ready to go. I've repositioned the screen so it's a little bit squarer to you. It's a bit easier to see what's actually on the screen. And I must explain something before I turn it on. This is a system on a chip. It itself takes a little bit of time to boot up. There's actually a little SD card in there somewhere which has the firmware. And it reads that, boots up, and then starts executing the code that allows it to translate the video, which it's actually snooping from the memory of the Apple II. It reads the memory directly, and then it does the translation that's needed to create a valid HDMI signal, which means you get, well, you'll see what you get. But there is a small delay when I turn it on. So let's just see that. So yeah, normally with a composite signal, we'd see this immediately, it'd be instantaneous. But as I said, in this case, there's a little bit of time. Once it's actually turned on, if you reset the machine, so I'm going to press Control, Apple and reset, it basically is running already. So there's not going to be any sort of blank screen again. Same thing if we press Control and reset, nothing's going to really happen. Okay, so before we finish off with VidHD, I'd like to show you a few more features of the card. Unfortunately, they are somewhat marred by the fact that the project has gone into a hiatus. I'm not sure why that is, but it's a bit of a big problem because unfortunately it was quite expensive when I bought it. It was about $135. And on top of that, there was also shipping from the US. All in, I was about $155 down with this particular card. It does work fine, but you'll see why it's a bit of a problem in a second. So I've installed my floppy EMU on here temporarily. We'll have a look at disk drives in a future video, but I've got it set up there so we'll actually load Choplifter when you turn on the machine. I've noticed that there does seem to be a little bit of an issue sometimes when you turn it on. I think the VidHD, when it initializes that first time, stops this potentially loading. So let's turn on the machine. And I'm able to actually see the tracks there advancing. What I found is when it doesn't work, it gets stuck on track 20. So right now, as I said, it's stuck on track 20. It's quite easy to get around that. I can just press Control, Apple and reset to restart the machine. And now I can see that the tracks are advancing and I'm expecting it to boot into Choplifter in a second. It does actually mention this issue inside the manual for VidHD, which is still available online. And there you go, there are the fantastic graphics. I did want to show you what the graphics look like, not just the, basically this sort of command line. As you can see, they're working fantastically well there. And I must admit, Choplifter is a game on the Apple II that I didn't know about until I got it, obviously. And it really is something of a star. This was one of the few games ever that went from a home micro to the arcade. It was actually put in the arcade, I think it was by Sega. So yeah, there was actually a micro to arcade conversion, which is very unusual. And what's nice about it as well is it works with analog controls because the joystick on the Apple II is analog. That makes it a lot more controllable. Yeah, really cool game. So anyway, the VidHD does actually have a menu. So if I press Control and 6, we're in the menu. And in here, it has a number of settings. Now, many of these settings are actually pretty cool. And it would be really nice if you could actually set it up and then save those values and then have that as your default. But unfortunately, the project went into a hiatus before that was finished. So it says down here that I've got the version 1.15 firmware And this is from 15th of February 2019. So yeah, going on for 7 years ago, unfortunately, this project stalled for some reason. Obviously stalled at a pretty advanced state, but there was some legs on it because there is the Wi-Fi antenna on that orange Pi. And obviously there's the static RAM as well, where settings can be stored, and neither of those actually got used in the end. So unfortunately, that's what happens sometimes when you get one of these internet projects. So we have settings to set the display to be monochrome, so you can turn off color if you want to. You can change the video mode. So right now it's doing a very sort of perfectionist conversion of the color. It does have color fringing, but it doesn't emulate fully what an actual monitor would look like, which in some cases can be a little bit different. The color fringing can be softer, and there is actually a mode there where you can actually turn that on. We'll have a look at that in a second. Text columns, 40 or 80. I've not actually managed to get that working with this particular setup. I thought that you would have had an actual 80 columns card. So yeah, not sure why that is there. I do actually have one of those, which is why I'm not really obsessed about that too much. Show scan lines. The default setting is light, and you can't turn that off because you can't save the settings. But at light, I actually do like it, as it turns out. So that's quite lucky, really. And then you've got screen colors. So you can have different color text, the background of the screen. You can change the color, the border, and then you can also make the border bigger as well. Then you can change the language of the card if you want to, and the actual refresh rate, which is currently 50 Hertz, which is correct for the UK. And if you've set all of these and you want to reset them back to the default, you can just go down to standards and toggle that, and it will set these back to the defaults. But actually you can do that just as easily just by restarting the machine. So let me just show you monochrome mode. If I go like that, press enter. There we go. It's now in monochrome mode. Unfortunately, the helicopter does look either like it needs to go to the toilet or like it's very impatient to go somewhere, or something else, maybe, whatever springs to your imagination. So there we are in monochrome mode. We can put it back just by doing that. Let's go down and change the mode to, let's actually put this back to default, which is monochrome no. And then we'll change this to NTSC PAL. When we go into this mode, it's a little bit tricky to see. So what I'll do is we'll zoom in on certain areas of the screen and I'll toggle back and forth between with this mode on or with the default HD TV mode. But basically in this mode, it emulates a real monitor a little bit more closely, and that can help with some of the color fringing in certain situations. Although it adds more, it actually makes it more subtle, which, yeah, in some circumstances makes the graphics a little bit more legible. So let's go back in. What else do we have? Text columns, like I said, not really found that much use for that. I can increase the scan lines there. Hopefully you can see that. I'll just go back and forth because they do get applied instantly. There we are. You can turn them off if you want to. But as I said, they don't get stored, and light is the default. So there we are. Then you've got the text color. So for instance, it was very common back in the day to use an Apple II with, let's say, a green screen monitor. So you can simulate that if you want to. And if you really wanted to create a sort of green screen look, you could increase the scan lines a lot more. And that's actually much closer to what you would actually see on a real green screen monitor. So really rocking the 1970s and early 80s there. We can change the background color. So let's just put that back to white. We'll go down and we'll change this to, let's say, dark blue. Do we have a light blue? Medium blue, okay. Yeah, so we could have a medium blue background color. You could change the border color to, let's say, the same. There we go. And then if you want to, you can change the size of the borders. Currently, we've got them turned on to wide borders, but you can actually make narrow borders if you want to. And with that turned on, if we go back to the, there we are. So if you wanted to make something looks a little bit more like a Commodore 64, you could have a blue background, or if you wanted it to look like a Spectrum, you could put in a, let's say, a light gray background with black text. But yeah, unfortunately, those settings don't get saved. So it is slightly academic, unfortunately. So how can this be fixed? Well, I would like to appeal to somebody out there in the Apple II community, or even if you're not, maybe if you're a coder and you fancy coming along and picking up this project and finishing off what they started, it would be very much appreciated by everybody out there who has a VidHD card. They're actually quite expensive to get these days. I've seen people selling them on eBay for $300, which seems bizarre, really, because they were only 150 brand new. I know that they work on an Apple II GS, so it could be that people are buying them for use on an Apple II GS. So there is actually one more solution, and before we finish off on this video, we'll have a look at that. So let's have a look at that next, and it is the A2DVI. So this is the Apple II DVI. It's been out for a little bit over a year now. It's an interesting project. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it here in terms of the way it works and all its features. Adrian's Digital Basement did a video on it. He did a really great job of running over all the ins and outs of it. So it's definitely worth seeking that out if you want to find out all the various details about it. What I will talk about is its provenance, where it came from, and it's quite interesting actually how it came about. We talked about in the last chapter the VidHD. That was made by a guy called John Brooks, and he first demoed that at KansasFest in 2018. And obviously at the time everybody was very impressed with it because, well, it's very clever the way that it works. That project eventually went into a hiatus, and ever since then I don't think it's been manufactured, unfortunately. It did make use of that Orange Pi system on a chip, and I'm assuming that because of the power of that chip, that particular technique was able to then be applied to the Apple II GS as well. So that card is quite capable. It will work on any of the Apple IIs, well, apart from the IIc where you can't fit it into the case. But it actually does work on the Apple II GS as well, which is quite impressive. And I've used it in my Apple II GS, and it definitely works in there. Now, since then, there have been other cards. So for example, there is the Apple II VGA. You can see this here, and you can see one of the big switches that it's made is it's using a Raspberry Pi Pico, which is a very cheap SoC. I think they cost about $5, something like that. They're not as powerful, I believe, as the Orange Pi. However, they are powerful enough to do most of what the VidHD does. Now, in this case, it uses John Brooks's trick of snooping the RAM. And again, it creates an image and then it outputs it, in this case, through a VGA connector. Useful for anybody out there who has a VGA monitor. That is one solution that you can actually seek out. However, since then, it has sort of been leapfrogged by this other card, the A2DVI. So let me show you how that came about. So right now, the sort of current model that you will see is this one out there. There may be newer versions. There are lots of different versions that I'm not sure how you pronounce the guy's name, Ral Palavev. Anyway, not sure about that, but Ral has been very productive over the last year and produced a number of different versions of it. This one is one of the intermediate evolutions. And if you look on eBay, you will find various vendors selling versions of these cards. Ral has actually got up to version 4.4. He seems to be very excited about it. Obviously, there's a big leap there. If you look on his GitHub, you'll see that it goes from version 2 to version 4. So there was some kind of conceptual leap going on there, I think. I'm not really that sure from his GitHub page exactly what advantages this model gives you over the 2.0 and up versions. Now, originally, this particular project was actually based on the VGA card. And here is an earlier version of the A2DVI. And interestingly, if you look on the left-hand side of the board there, you can see there is actually a VGA connector. On top right, you have HDMI. So in fact, it's actually quite viable to still make this. This is a version 1.6. You can go onto GitHub, you can get the Gerbers for this project, have them made on, let's say, PCBWay, and make yourself one of these cards. So if you fancy having a card that can give you either VGA out or HDMI, you can still do that. However, Ral does actually point out that you can't actually have both active at the same time. The card is either going to be using the VGA firmware or the HDMI firmware, but you could do it if you wanted to. Now, as I said, Adrian's Digital Basement goes into all the various features of this card. This is the configuration screen here. You can see it's using the version 1.3A1 of the firmware. And it has many features which are mostly kind of similar to what you saw in VidHD. However, a big difference is, if you look down there, can you see the S feature, Save to Flash? Yeah, that's right. You can actually save your settings with this particular card. Another thing which is a big recommender of it as well is the price. You can get these for about $35 plus delivery. I unfortunately do not have one of these cards, so I can't actually show it to you working. But I've seen Adrian's video on this card and it does seem to be very capable. It has a analog render effects, that's option 8 there that you can see. That can be chosen to apply to certain video modes, and it does something very similar to the NTSC PAL mode that we saw with the VidHD. It emulates the way the card would appear on a real monitor. So definitely very much inspired by VidHD. VidHD hasn't really gone away. It's just unfortunately the baton has had to be picked up by others to run on with the basic concept. And I must admit, this card looks more capable than VidHD. It's obviously available right now, and it's very cheap as well at $35. So you may want to obviously plumb for this as your option for having card-based HDMI output from your Apple II. So there we are. That is our whistle-stop tour of getting video working on an Apple II in 2025. In this case, it was using my Apple IIe. Now, some of the things in this video would have seemed very obvious to you if you are a hardcore Apple II owner from back in the day, but I'm also aiming this video at people who have never used one before, and it's an exploration of how we would use this machine in 2025. When I received my machine, there were quite a few mysteries, and I want to, help promote people using these machines, especially, for instance, in the UK, where these machines were not common back in the 1970s and 1980s, very expensive machines, but now they are available to people over here, especially in the retro community. Well, anyone really. If you want to get one of this machine, just go on eBay and buy one from the United States. And yeah, they're very, very interesting machines. Now, I got mine from the UK, and therefore it's a PAL machine, and that's probably what you want to do as well. But these days, it's not really that much of a barrier anymore. When this machine came out, it was using composite video, as we saw, and that means that you would have had to have got a composite monitor, for instance, like this PVM that we saw here. Now, as I said, these are pretty expensive these days. You can get other monitors, more modern monitors, which also have composite in, but we saw that when we used it with my cheap and cheerful monitor from China, that there were issues with the image. It was kind of green, and you can see right here, the composite image is actually pretty mint. We also have the ability to use cards to get video out like this onto a HDMI monitor. And I think today that's pretty much the preferred solution. You can obviously get HDMI monitors of massive proportions, 4K monitors, which are 77-inch. So if you wanted to, and if your spouse allowed, you could have your Apple IIe in the living room on a 77-inch screen, which would have made Steve Wozniak swoon, I would imagine, back in 1977. So in the next video in the series, what we're going to do is we're going to look at something of a piece of genius, I think, from Steve Wozniak, and that is the disk-to floppy disk system. Now, that drive in itself is a part of retro computing lore and history. It was a piece of equipment for the Apple II, which I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying completely redefined its future. It changed the way that the machine was used, and it also allowed for the development of many, many high-quality games that were later very influential on other machines. In the UK, we tend to think that microcomputing started in 1982 with the release of the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64, but the reality is it was initially kicked off over in the States in 1977. And between 77 and 82, a lot of water flowed under the bridge in terms of software development. And the Disk 2 was pretty pivotal in that. So I think that's going to be a pretty interesting video when it gets released. Working on it right now. And yeah, I hopefully will have that out pretty soon. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please make sure you click on the like button. And if you are here for the first time and you would like to see the next video in this series or any other videos that I produce, then please make sure you click on subscribe and also hit the bell button there so you get notified for when videos are released by myself. Anyway, until the next video, I hope you have a good day, and until then, take care.